Do you want to know how to make Cadillac buffs really annoyed? Tell them the original Cadillac was nothing more than a Ford with a Cadillac name slapped on the front, because in many ways, that's true. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, an amazing collection of more than 170 cars that really spans the full automotive spectrum. I mean, we have a C8 Corvette, that mid-engine marvel, the same kind of high-tech car you see on the road today. And then we have this car right here. It is a 1905 Cadillac. It's a Type F. This is the oldest car that we have here at the museum, oldest original car. Now, I will say we have a replica of the 1886 Benz, the car that's considered the first production car that used an internal combustion engine. But this 1905 Cadillac Type F is the oldest original car that we have in our collection. But before we get to this, make sure you like and subscribe. And if we get something wrong, well, make sure you point it out in the comments down below, because we want to make sure our facts are right. Now, before we talk about this car in particular, we have to talk about the roots of the Cadillac company. Well, it turns out that Cadillac was actually formed by what was left of the original Henry Ford company. Henry Ford had had a dispute with his financial backers, the board of directors. He left and they were left with the company. They couldn't at first figure out what they were going to do with it. Then they brought in a gentleman by the name of Henry Leland. At that point, he was the head of Leland and Falconer Manufacturing Company. He was originally just brought in to appraise the plant, but he decided that it would be better off if they kept building cars. And they established the Cadillac Automobile Company in 1902 and started building cars. The first Cadillacs, called the Runabout and the Tonneau, were completed in 1902. And yes, they were basically the identical car that was the original Ford Model A that Henry Ford had planned to build for 1903. So where did they get the name Cadillac? Well, they didn't look very far. They were in Detroit, and the man who was credited with founding Detroit, Antoine de la Mort sur de Cadillac. Okay, I'm sure I butchered that with my little lame French accent, but you get the idea. He's the guy who came over from France, and he was exploring an awful lot of the New World back in those days. He used the title Sieur de Cadillac, as in Lord of Cadillac. Cadillac was a region in the southwest of France, but apparently he just made up the title. He really had no nobility at all. In history, well, some people like him, some people don't like him quite so much. Doesn't really matter at the end of the day. He is the guy who's responsible, or claimed responsibility, for founding the city of Detroit. Now, the original Cadillac was not called the Model A. It was called the Runabout or the Tonneau, as I mentioned. They apparently didn't want to carry too much of Henry Ford over to the new model. However, they did, after that, go on with the alphabetical lettering of the cars. It was the Model B, the C, the D, the E, and of course the Model F that they have right here. When this came out in 1905, there was something significant that happened from a styling perspective that really changed a lot in the automotive world, and they decided they wanted to make it more modern looking. Up until that point, they had a sloped nose on the front, the Runabout. That's exactly what it had. But for 1905, they decided with this Model F that they wanted to create this hood that covered up the front. Now, there is no engine up there. That's down below. I'll show you that in just a little bit. There's a water tank up there that's holding the water for the radiator, keep everything cool. But they went with this more modern hood style, and guess what? Everybody loved it. And it was so popular, they actually began to retrofit these on some of the earlier models that didn't have this same styling. So this, in many ways, stepped Cadillac forward in an awful lot of ways. Now, one other thing that was really significant about Cadillac back in those days, and really helped make the Cadillac brand and the Cadillac style so important, was the fact that Henry Leland was a big fan of using parts that were interchangeable, that had a very specific design and style to them. So you could take it off one car and put it on another. The parts were not custom made. They were all designed to a specific specification. As a result, it made building these cars a lot easier, and it made maintaining these cars a lot easier. And that contributed to the concept of Cadillac quality. Let's take a walk around and look at the Cadillac from 1905, this Model F. And while that nose was really new, and I talked about the fact that people wanted it on their older style cars, there's something else that was significant in 1905, which I believe this was the very first appearance of the Cadillac scripted name on the front of the car. We got used to that over time, but the concept of having the Cadillac name scripted on the front, similar to Henry Ford, was what they were using for 1905. This is a car that's from what we call the brass era, the late 1800s through about 1915, and you can see why the extensive use of brass, both in this headlight, this driving light, and then of course the horn all across the railing. There was no shortage of brass being used all over this car. Underneath, as you look, you can see what the suspension is like. And this is mounted from side to side, transverse mounted. And you'll notice that there's a spring up here at the top, then the axle that goes to right there. And it just has a single point right here that is giving all the flex, allowing for the car itself to, bounce up and down a little more smoothly. And that's what they were using back in those days. In some ways, it's similar to what the Model T did as it moved on, although the Model T had a different axle style as they were doing that. It was a very open vehicle. They didn't really have very many closed vehicles back then. You were sitting on the right-hand side of the car. They didn't get left-hand drive until significantly later. This car is supposed to have a door that goes right here that would have closed this off. Although, to be honest with you, I'm not sure it would have made a lot of difference in terms of keeping things very warm back there, although it might have helped a little bit. I believe this is where you could have had a top going over there. On the back, once again, we're still in the brass area, this brass lamp. You didn't have turn signals, you didn't have stoplights back in those days. All you had was this one brass lamp that you could use for letting people behind you know that there was a car ahead of them, although I'm guessing the smoke and the noise probably was a good clue. There, we'll look at the rear end from down below. Fenders, well, about as simple as you could possibly ask for right here. They simply slope down. It's one piece of metal that's been flattened out. I do think it's an interesting styling touch that they've done here where they've flared this fender out. Yes, it's just kind of a flat piece of metal, but they've flared it, as you can see, whereas that one is just flat over the wheel. This one has an angle to it. Awful lot of wood being used back in those days. There you see the dash right there, and of course, as you look on the inside of the car, you're not going to see any instruments. We've got wood down here, wood in the back as well. So, yeah, it was about as comfortable as you could ask for 1905 in the automotive world. Because remember, the roads weren't that great. You were bouncing along mostly on dirt roads, and having something, well, that had at least some suspension travel probably helped a bit. But boy, it was pretty darn rudimentary if you were looking for an automobile. Showing off the engine in this 1905 Cadillac is a little more complicated than normal. I can't simply lift the hood. Remember, there's no engine up there. The engine itself is mounted underneath the car, slightly off on the side on the opposite of the driver, so it would kind of balance things out. It's a one-cylinder motor, 98 cubic inches, delivers 9 horsepower. This is, in essence, the crankcase down here. As I mentioned, you crank it over. You would put the crank in on the outside. This flywheel is what you would be turning, and that would allow the engine to kick over. The single piston is over here. Remember I mentioned that little device where you add fuel to the carburetor. That's exactly what you were doing with this right here. There is an exhaust system. You can see the tubing, the pipe, which is a little more modern, I think, running through here, and that's how it was coming out over there. A single chain drive coming back. I think it had 2 speeds, and that's what would connect to the rear axle right there. Big ground clearance back in those days because roads were really bad, so everything had to be up to pretty much as high as possible to make sure that it was protected. And actually, the suspension parts on either side, the axles on either side, were really what was protecting the engine right here. And in front, where we pointed out the fact that it had the leaf springs that went side to side. In the rear, they're longitudinal. They go from front to back, the leaf springs that are adding for the comfort of those people inside. Underneath, of course, we can see a lot more wood being used. But this is what it looked like underneath. It was pretty rudimentary, but got to remember, for its day, it was also very advanced. Starting a car in this era was a lot more complicated than just taking a key and putting it in the ignition and turning it. There was no electric starter back in those days. You began by adjusting the spark, which was this little lever right here. You then set the throttle, that was right underneath the steering wheel. You had an ignition switch, which was right here. Then you would go to the other side of the car and you would find this little lever right here, and you would use that to what they call tickling the carburetor, adding some fuel to the carburetor, almost choking it and getting it ready. Then you put a crank in here and turned it, and if all went well, the engine started up. Once the engine got going, you had to climb into the car. To be honest with you, it's a little more complicated than you would think at first. Yeah, there should be plenty of room, but it's actually pretty tight between the steering wheel and the seat. Now, once you actually got into the seat and you pulled all the way back, you actually had plenty of room. They just didn't have tilt-away steering wheels back in those days. Very upright steering position. But you have to remember, just a few years earlier, they had tillers that were center-mounted. So this was a much more modern way of doing things. As I mentioned, you set the throttle right here, and this was actually how you controlled the speed of the car, by controlling this throttle right here. So that's exactly what we'd use to accelerate or slow down. If you wanted to actually brake, well, that was over here on the side, this lever. You would pull it, and what that did was that actually had a small strap that went around a wheel that was attached to the engine and the transmission, and it would actually pinch down on that to slow the vehicle down. No windshield. Nothing to really protect you from the environment at that point. Of course, just a few years that would become very, very common. But the concept of driving this car back in those days really required a lot of thinking. You know, first in terms of how you started it, then in how you went along and adjusted the gears, everything you had to do. I think it only had 2 speeds. I believe it also had a reverse. But the important thing was that it actually worked. And that's what was so great about Cadillac. You know, there were a lot of car companies that were coming out back in those days, but because they had those parts that were consistent from car to car, their cars were pretty consistent. They were also pretty strong in the performance world. I mean, I believe there was somebody over in Europe who entered a hill climb very early on and won. There was also a 1,000-mile durability test that they won. So pretty much right out of the gate, Henry Leland and his Cadillac company decided that they were going to be a performance vehicle that was going to be consistent, that people could count on. And that's how it led to the concept of Cadillac quality. As I mentioned, here at the Martin Auto Museum, we have not only a 1905 Cadillac, but we also have a replica of the 1886 Benz motor wagon. This is the vehicle that Carl Benz produced, and it is often referred to as the very first production vehicle, the one that used an internal combustion engine, and that's what it looked like. And I want to take a moment to compare what cars would have been like in 1886, the very beginning, and change to 1905. Now think about this. This is a 20-year difference. First off, it's a tricycle, right? You just have the 3. You have what we call a tiller control right here. You're not really controlling very much else with this. And look how the engine is exposed completely in the back. And it has these giant, really what are bicycle wheels. Now compare that to that 1905 Cadillac and how in just 20 years the concept of technology in an automobile had changed radically. This big coach where you could actually put people and have them sit comfortably in a back seat. The front seat with all those controls, the spark you use, the throttle you control, the headlights on the front, the cooling system that was under that hood, the radiator, the fenders that were protecting you from the mud that was probably slinging out. Go back to just 20 years earlier, the very beginning of the automotive world. Boy, it's as rudimentary as it gets. Just a seat, a tiller, an engine hanging off the back. Imagine just 20 years from this to that. You have to remember, when this Cadillac was being built in 1905, there were literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of car makers in the United States. So why is it nearly all of them are gone and Cadillac is still around today? Well, I think you have to thank Henry Leland. First off, his vision in looking at the factory and realizing that there was a car to be built. His desire to make sure that all of the car's parts were consistent so they could be interchanged from one to the next, making the manufacturing process easier, as well as the repair process easy as well. And really that led to the concept of Cadillac quality. You know, Cadillac, the standard of the world as we knew it for so many decades, and even today with the high quality Cadillacs that are being produced and the ability to call it a luxury car. The fact that ultimately Cadillac was part of what became General Motors was also significant. Deep enough pockets that it was able to continue on. They weren't building a Model T with this car. They didn't have to. They were building a car that was built to a higher standard, a luxury car, and so as a result, they were able to do more with it. By the way, I should mention that while there were different models that were being built at this point in time, this was the Model F with a single cylinder, they were also building, I think it was the Model E, that was the beginning of the 4-cylinder world for Cadillac back then. So even at this point in 1905, they were looking to the future to figure out what did Cadillac need to be. And when you look at the automotive evolution, Cadillac is absolutely a critical part of it.